The rain had stopped 3 days ago, but the Blackwood Valley retained water with the stubborn grip of a sponge dipped in glue. Here, deep in the American heartland, the earth was not merely dirt. It was a primordial soup of glacial till and dense, saturated clay. This valley was the critical choke point for the new Interstate 88 Trade Corridor overpass, a billion-dollar infrastructure initiative designed to shave hours off cross-country freight routes. It was a project defined by its unforgiving margins. Every day of delay triggered a $100,000 penalty clause. Right now, the project was indefinitely halted, held hostage by the very ground it sought to conquer. At the epicenter of a sprawling, churned-up mudflat sat the centerpiece of the operation, a custom-configured, ultra-heavy-lift crawler crane. Weighing in at a staggering 500 tons, it was a cathedral of high-tensile steel, hydraulic muscle, and computerized precision. It was designed to hoist massive precast concrete bridge segments into the sky. Instead, it was slowly returning to the earth. The crane had breached a subterranean pocket of supersaturated clay that the geological surveys had completely missed. It hadn't just sunk, it had wallowed. The massive steel tracks, each the size of a city bus, were buried out of sight. The chassis was resting flush with the mudline, and worse, the entire superstructure was listing at a perilous 6-degree angle. If the list reached 8 degrees, the structural shear forces would permanently warp the main boom. Inside the primary command trailer, perched on a stabilized ridge overlooking the disaster, the atmosphere was a toxic mixture of stale coffee, body odor, and impending career ruin. Dr. Elias Thorne, the lead geotechnical engineer, dragged a trembling hand down his face. His desk was littered with topographic maps, soil density readouts, and finite element analysis printouts. He held 3 degrees from MIT, but right now, none of them could tell him how to defeat a patch of wet dirt. "The suction coefficient is off the charts," Dr. Thorne said, his voice tight. He pointed to a brightly colored 3D model on his monitor. "The clay has formed a perfect hermetic seal around the undercarriage. It's not just the 500 tons of dead weight we're fighting. The mud is actively holding onto it. It's creating a vacuum effect. Every time we try to pull, the earth pulls back." Sarah Jenkins, the project manager, paced the narrow length of the trailer. She was a woman known for bending massive logistical operations to her will, but she looked thoroughly defeated. "Elias, I don't care about the coefficient. I care about the calendar. The governor is supposed to cut a ribbon here in 6 months. Tell me what we haven't tried." Mark, the site foreman, leaned against the doorframe. He was caked in dried gray mud from his hard hat to his steel-toed boots. He looked like a man who had been losing a war of attrition for 48 straight hours. "We've tried everything in the modern playbook, Sarah," he grunted. "Yesterday, I chained 3 Caterpillar D11 dozers to the towing lugs. That's nearly 3,000 horsepower. We used synthetic kinetic recovery ropes, thick as my thigh." "And?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "And they stretched, snapped, and nearly decapitated an operator," Mark said grimly. "The dozers just dug themselves into trenches. Then we brought in the heavy-lift winch trucks, 6 of them. We managed to generate enough tensile force to start bending the crane's secondary tow hooks, but the tracks didn't budge a millimeter. Last night, we tried high-pressure water jets to break the suction beneath the chassis. The mud just swallowed the water and turned into a heavier slurry. We are making it worse." Silence descended on the trailer, broken only by the hum of the air conditioner and the distant futile roar of a diesel engine spinning its wheels in the valley below. "So what is the official recommendation?" Sarah finally asked, bracing herself. Dr. Thorne adjusted his glasses, refusing to meet her eyes. "The official geotechnical recommendation is to declare the unit immovable under current environmental conditions. We need to bring in a specialized disassembly crew. We take the crane apart in situ. Boom first, then the counterweights, the cab, the car body, and finally dig out the tracks." Sarah stopped pacing. "Disassemble a 500-ton crane in a mud pit? Elias, that will take 2 months just to tear it down, let alone extract it and rebuild it. The penalty clauses will bankrupt the lead contractor. My career will be over, and you'll be teaching Intro to Dirt at a community college." "Physics doesn't care about our deadlines, Sarah," Thorne replied defensively. "The friction is too great. Any further dynamic pulling with modern high-speed winches will shear the crane's frame." From the corner of the trailer, a throat cleared. It was Toby, a 20-year-old local engineering intern whose primary job was making coffee and running blueprints through the mud. "Excuse me," Toby mumbled, shrinking under the sudden glare of the 3 senior managers. "If the high-speed stuff is breaking, what about low speed?" "Toby, this isn't a stuck pickup truck," Mark sighed. We need massive force. Right, but, well, there's a guy who lives a few miles up the ridge, Old Man Thorne. No relation to you, Doc, I think, Toby said, looking at the engineer. He farms the tough land up there. He's always pulling massive old stumps and dragged a derailed freight car out of a ditch for the county back in the 90s. He's got this machine, a big one. Dr. Thorne scoffed loudly. A local farmer with a John Deere? Kid, we have a fleet of D11 bulldozers that cost $2 million apiece down there failing. A farm tractor is going to do nothing but get in the way. It's not a regular tractor, Toby insisted, his face turning red. He knows this valley's dirt better than anyone. My dad says he knows how the mud breathes. It might be worth just letting him look. Sarah looked out the window at the multi-million-dollar monument to failure sinking in the muck. Get him, she said quietly. Sarah, you can't be serious, Dr. Thorne protested. We have liability protocols. We have insurance adjusters arriving tomorrow. We can't have a local yokel wandering a highly hazardous disaster site. Elias, our official plan is to spend 2 months taking a jigsaw puzzle apart in a swamp. I will take input from the devil himself if he knows how to break a vacuum seal, Sarah snapped. Toby, call him. 2 hours later, the heavy reinforced door of the trailer swung open. The man who stepped inside stood in stark, jarring contrast to the glowing monitors and sterile whiteboards of the modern engineering hub. Elias Thorne, the farmer, was a man carved from the very landscape they were trying to pave over. He looked to be in his late 60s, with a face weathered like old leather and deep-set eyes that held a quiet, calculating intelligence. He wore faded denim overalls stained with decades of grease, a heavy flannel shirt, and a battered tweed flat cap. In his right hand, he carried a small, incredibly heavy-looking toolbox made of riveted steel, its handle polished smooth by years of use. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't look at the PhDs or the project manager. He walked straight to the expansive window looking down into the valley, his eyes locking onto the stranded behemoth. You brought heavy iron into a clay bowl right after the spring thaw, the old man said. His voice was gravelly, quiet, but carried effortlessly across the room. The earth here, it doesn't compress, it just displaces, and when you sit something heavy on it, it hugs it tight. Mr. Thorne, I'm Sarah Jenkins, the project manager, Sarah said, stepping forward, extending a hand. The old man nodded respectfully, shifting his toolbox to shake her hand. His grip was like a vice. Can you help us? She asked. I need to feel it first, he replied simply. Despite the frantic protests of the site safety officer regarding high-visibility vests and hard hats, the old farmer walked down the muddy embankment wearing nothing but his standard work clothes. Dr. Thorne, Sarah, and Mark trailed behind him, looking like a heavily armored tactical team escorting a civilian. The site was a graveyard of modern engineering. Deep water-filled trenches scarred the earth where the dozers had fought and lost. Broken steel cables lay coiled in the mud like dead snakes. Towering above it all was the listing crane, groaning subtly as it settled another fraction of an inch. The old man didn't look at the broken equipment. He walked right to the edge of the stagnant gray mud pooling around the crane's massive tracks. He didn't use a penetrometer or a moisture probe. He crouched down, picked up a long, sturdy branch from the ground, and drove it deep into the muck near the steel treads. He leaned his weight into it, feeling the resistance, feeling the way the earth gripped the wood. Then he pulled. The mud yielded with a wet, heavy sucking sound. He pulled off one leather glove, scooped up a handful of the freezing gray sludge, and squeezed it in his bare fist. He smelled it. He rubbed the grit between his thumb and forefinger. Dr. Thorne watched this primitive display with visible disdain. It's highly cohesive elite clay mixed with glacial till, the engineer stated, quoting his reports. The shear strength is practically non-existent when wet, but its adhesive properties are enormous. The vacuum beneath the chassis requires approximately 1.2 million pounds of force to break. The farmer wiped his hand on his overalls and stood up slowly. He looked at the young engineer. Your math might be right, son, the old man said gently, but your method is wrong. I saw the snapped ropes up there. You fellas tried to yank it out. We applied maximum dynamic kinetic force, Mark the foreman defended. You tried to bully the mud, the farmer corrected. You tried to snatch it out with a sudden jerk. Mud like this, old mud, deep mud, it acts like a non-Newtonian fluid under sudden stress. You yank it, it instantly hardens and grips tighter. It becomes concrete. That's why your lines broke. You were fighting the earth, and the earth will always win a sudden fight. Sarah stepped forward. So what's the alternative? We can't push it. We can't pull it. You don't jerk it, the old man said, looking up at the massive steel frame. You persuade it. You need a force that doesn't peak and drop like an internal combustion engine hitting the end of its torque curve. You need a force that applies 1,000,000 pounds of pressure and then just holds it there, forever if need be. A continuous, unrelenting strain that never backs off a single ounce. You give the mud time to realize it's losing. You let the vacuum bleed out, slow and steady. No modern winch can maintain max torque indefinitely without burning out the hydraulic pumps or snapping the line from microfluctuations, Dr. Thorne argued. It's an engineering impossibility with current field equipment. A slow smile cracked the weathered lines of the farmer's face. That's because your modern equipment is built for speed and efficiency, built to go fast. What you need is something built for nothing but raw, slow, endless power. Something that breathes fire and drinks water. And what is that? Sarah asked. I'll be back at dawn, the old man said, turning to walk back up the hill. Clear your machines out of the way, and find me the thickest steel haulage cable you have on this site. Braided steel, not that plastic synthetic garbage. The next morning, the Blackwood Valley was blanketed in a thick, chilling fog. The construction crew, mostly demoralized and exhausted, had gathered on the ridge, drinking coffee and waiting to see the farmer's supposed miracle. The modern heavy equipment, the Cats, the Volvos, the Liebherrs, were parked at the periphery, silent and useless. At 6:30 a.m., they didn't see the machine first, they felt it. It wasn't the high-pitched, frenetic vibration of a diesel engine. It was a deep, rhythmic, seismic thump that seemed to travel through the bedrock itself. Hiss, clack, hiss. Hiss, clack, hiss. Then came the smell. Overpowering the scent of damp earth and diesel fumes came the sharp, acrid, unmistakable odor of burning soft coal and hot, lubricating oil. Parting the morning fog like a ghost ship emerging from the mist, Elias Thorne's machine arrived. A collective gasp rippled through the ranks of the modern construction workers. It wasn't a tractor. It was a Leviathan of the Industrial Revolution. It was a 1920 Case 80 horsepower steam traction engine. It was utterly massive, a terrifying marriage of black iron, polished brass, and exposed, churning mechanics. At the front sat a cavernous smokestack, belching a thick column of dark gray smoke into the sky. Behind it rested the massive boiler, banded in steel. But it was the wheels that commanded awe. They were taller than a man, made of solid cast iron, and fitted with vicious, angled steel lugs designed to bite into the earth and never let go. At the rear, the farmer stood on the operator's platform, dwarfed by the massive flywheel spinning with mesmerizing, terrifying momentum. Towed behind this mechanical dinosaur was a heavy wooden wagon, ancient but impeccably maintained, loaded down with massive chains, iron snatch blocks the size of anvils, and heavy timber mats. The old man steered the hissing, clanking beast down the muddy incline with the casual grace of a man walking a familiar dog. He didn't avoid the mud, he drove straight into the churned-up disaster zone. The massive iron wheels sank slightly, but the sheer weight of the machine, nearly 12 tons of solid iron and water, pressed the mud down, finding the hardpan beneath. He brought the steam engine to a halt about 200 feet from the stranded crane, perfectly aligned with its heavy undercarriage. He pulled a brass lever, and the massive engine let out a deafening, piercing whistle that echoed off the valley walls, signaling he was ready to work. Up on the ridge, the trio of experts watched in a state of shock. Sarah Jenkins stared, her mouth slightly open. "Is that a museum piece?" Dr. Thorne was shaking his head violently. "This is a circus. That thing is a century old. It has an 80 horsepower rating. My truck has 400 horsepower. It's going to snap an axle or blow itself up." Mark, the foreman, was already jogging down the hill, his face a mask of panic. He ran toward the farmer, gesturing wildly. "Hey, stop!" Mark yelled over the rhythmic chuffing of the idling steam engine. "You're too close to the soft zone. If that antique sinks, I don't have anything big enough left to pull you out." Elias Thorne didn't look at the foreman. He was busy unchaining the heavy timber mats from his wagon. "It won't sink," the old man said calmly. "It's heavy enough to reach the bottom, and the lugs hold the earth. Now, fetch your men. I need help rigging the blocks. This iron is too heavy for an old man to lift alone." For the next 2 hours, the site transformed into a scene from a bygone era. Under the farmer's quiet, absolute direction, the crew abandoned their digital load cell monitors and laser levels. They wrestled with massive, grease-caked iron snatch blocks, hauling them through the mud. Elias was establishing a complex block and tackle system. He wasn't just connecting a cable from his engine to the crane. He was weaving a mechanical advantage. He anchored one massive pulley to the heavy towing eyes of the 500-ton crane. He anchored another to a massive steel piling they had driven deep into the bedrock days ago. He laced a 2-inch thick braided steel cable back and forth between them, finally attaching the bitter end to the massive, gear-driven winch drum mounted beneath the boiler of his steam engine. "He's multiplying the torque," Dr. Thorne muttered, standing a safe distance away, watching the geometry of the cables take shape. A 4-to-1 mechanical advantage, but it's still relying on the traction of that single machine. The setup was complete. The massive steel cable lay slack in the mud, a serpentine lifeline between the 1920s and the 2020s. Elias Thorne walked around his machine, a long-spouted oil can in hand, meticulously lubricating the massive open gears and bearings. He climbed onto the operator's platform. He threw a few more shovelfuls of coal into the roaring firebox, the orange glow illuminating his weathered face. He checked the brass pressure gauge. The needle was climbing steadily, past 100 psi, approaching 150. The safety valve began to hiss, a dragon clearing its throat. Down in the mud, Mark the foreman threw his arms up in a gesture of pure, helpless anxiety. He pointed at the massive iron wheels of the case engine, then at the sunken crane. Dr. Thorne stood beside him, his hands clutching his hard hat in a tight grip, his mind calculating the immense, catastrophic shear forces about to be unleashed. He was certain the ancient iron gears of the steam engine would shatter like glass under the strain. Sarah Jenkins stood a few paces back, her arms crossed tight across her chest, watching with a sickening sense of dread. If this failed, if the cable snapped and killed someone, or if this antique machine tore the crane's chassis apart, she was going to prison. The tableau was perfect. Modern expertise frozen in panic, pointing and bracing for a disaster, while the old farmer stood serene amidst the steam. Elias looked out over the mud, taking a deep breath of the cold morning air. He reached out and grabbed the heavy iron clutch lever. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled it back. The massive winch drum beneath the boiler groaned and began to turn. The slack in the heavy steel cable was taken up. It rose from the mud, dripping gray slime, until it pulled tight between the steam engine and the 500-ton crane. It became a perfectly straight, rigid line of death-dealing tension. The ancient case engine settled on its haunches. The massive iron wheels bit an inch deeper into the earth. The rhythmic chuff-chuff-chuff of the exhaust slowed, growing deeper, louder, taking on a heavy, metallic labor. The pull had begun. The heavy iron clutch lever snapped securely into its final detent. Beneath the massive, riveted belly of the boiler, the main drive gear engaged with a heavy metallic clank that vibrated through the steel deck plates. The 2-inch thick braided steel haulage cable, spanning the 200 feet between the 1920 case steam engine and the submerged 500-ton crawler crane, immediately snapped off the muddy ground. It went from a drooping, slime-covered snake to a rigid, horizontal line of terrifying potential energy in a fraction of a second. Water instantly squeezed out of the tightly woven steel strands, raining down onto the churned earth. Up on the operator's platform, Elias Thorne stood with his hand resting lightly on the brass throttle lever, his eyes fixed intently on the drum. He didn't look at the trapped crane. He listened to his machine. The exhaust note of the case altered instantly. The steady, rhythmic hiss-clack transformed into a deep, concussive whomp, whomp, whomp that punched the air. Black smoke poured from the chimney in thick, violent rhythmic puffs, each one representing a massive pulse of steam pressing against the cylinder head. The front end of the 12-ton tractor lightened slightly as the immense torque transferred through the chassis. The massive, lugged rear drive wheels bit deeply into the hardpan beneath the surface mud. Down in the basin, Dr. Thorne, Sarah Jenkins, and Mark stood paralyzed behind a temporary barricade, watching the impossible physics play out. The cable hummed. It was a literal low-frequency vibration that the engineers could feel in their chests. Near the buried tracks of the crane, the saturated gray clay began to dimple and ooze, water pooling as the earth was subjected to an unrelenting squeeze. "The tension is approaching 300,000 pounds, Dr. Thorne whispered, his eyes wide, rapidly calculating the mechanical advantage of the block and tackle rigging combined with the engine's theoretical drawbar pull. "It's going to snap. The crane isn't moving." He was right. The gargantuan crawler crane remained locked in the Earth's vacuum grip, listing at its dangerous 6-degree angle. The friction of the mud was absolute. On the case, Elias felt the telltale shudder through his boots. The machine had reached a stalemate. The immense cast-iron flywheel on the side of the boiler was still spinning, but the winch drum beneath had stopped turning. A sharp, acrid smell of burning wood and asbestos filled the air, accompanied by a high-pitched squeal. The main clutch shoes, designed to protect the gear train from catastrophic failure, were slipping under the impossible load. Without hesitation, Elias violently threw the clutch lever forward, disengaging the drum. The steel cable whipped slightly as the immediate tension was released, though it remained taut. The steam engine immediately spun up, its exhaust returning to a rapid, lighter rhythm. Elias closed the throttle and blew down the excess steam. The sudden quiet that fell over the valley was heavy, filled only with the hissing of the boiler and the settling groans of the trapped crane. Dr. Thorne let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "I told you, it's an issue of scale. You can't fight 500,000 pounds of vacuum-sealed steel with a farm toy." Elias ignored him. He climbed down from the iron platform with methodical slowness, retrieving his heavy, steel-riveted toolbox. He walked to the ancient wooden wagon hooked to the rear of his tractor. He didn't look defeated. He looked like a man who had simply gathered the necessary data. "Need more purchase," the old farmer muttered to himself. He pulled out 2 more massive, double-sheave iron snatch blocks. They were incredibly heavy, requiring him to drag them through the mud rather than carry them. Mark, seeing the old man struggling, broke his frozen stance. "Toby, get down there and help him!" The young intern scrambled down the muddy bank. To Mark's own surprise, he followed. "What are you doing?" Mark asked, his voice shaking slightly as he looked at the massive hot iron wheels of the steam tractor. "I need to reeve the line," Elias said, handing a heavy length of chain to the foreman. "We are going from a 4-to-1 to a 9-to-1 mechanical advantage. I had to see how much the mud was willing to give. It's greedy today. We need to negotiate harder." For 30 minutes, they worked in the mud, rerouting the 2-inch steel cable through the complex new arrangement of iron pulleys. By the time they finished, the rigging looked like a giant, deadly spiderweb woven between the modern behemoth and the antique Titan. Elias climbed back aboard. He checked his water sight glass and shoveled 3 heavy scoops of bituminous coal directly into the roaring, white-hot center of the firebox. He closed the heavy iron door with his boot. He watched the brass needle of the pressure gauge climb steadily. 120 psi, 140. When the needle brushed 150, the brass safety relief valve on top of the boiler popped open with a deafening, shrieking roar, venting a massive plume of pure white steam into the gray sky. The engine was at absolute maximum working pressure. It was a terrifying display of harnessed, volatile energy. "Clear the rigging line," Elias bellowed, his voice barely cutting through the roar of escaping steam. "Get behind the dozers, now!" Mark and Toby ran. Sarah and Dr. Thorne backed up, taking shelter behind the steel tracks of a parked excavator. Elias pulled the throttle wide open. The machine shook violently. He gripped the clutch lever and, with both hands and the weight of his body, hauled it back into the locked position. The impact on the cable was instantaneous and brutal. The 9-to-1 mechanical advantage multiplied the engine's torque to a staggering degree. The massive winch drum groaned, fighting for every millimeter of rotation. The steel cable didn't just hum, it screamed. It became a perfectly rigid rod of metal, singing a terrifying high-pitched note of molecular distress. The sound of the steam engine's exhaust became a frantic, thunderous booming, echoing off the valley walls like artillery fire. Black smoke blotted out the sun. Suddenly, a sound like a cannon shot shattered the air. Crack! A massive forged steel D-shackle, connecting one of the secondary anchor chains to the main piling, sheared completely in half under the immense strain. The heavy iron snatch block, now suddenly free, was violently whipped backward by the tension. It flew through the air like a cannonball, trailing 30 feet of heavy chain. It slammed into a temporary steel guardrail 20 feet to the left of where Sarah and Dr. Thorne were taking cover, instantly obliterating the thick steel pipes and sending shrapnel flying into the mud. Sarah screamed, dropping to her knees. Mark scrambled up the bank, his face pale. "Shut it down! Shut it down right now!" Mark roared, waving his arms frantically. "You're going to kill someone. The rigging can't hold." Up on the platform, Elias Thorne did not flinch. He did not close the throttle. He reached out and grabbed the whistle cord, giving one short, sharp blast to signal he was aware, but he kept his hand firmly on the locked clutch lever. He analyzed the failure in an instant. It was a secondary anchor, not the main haulage line. The primary system was still intact, but the geometry had shifted. He was now pulling slightly off-center, which meant his own machine was going to be dragged toward the mud pit. "Boy!" Elias yelled, pointing a grease-stained finger directly at Mark. "The timber mats! On the wagon! Lay them crossways right in front of my front wheels! Now! I have to crawl it forward to keep the line fair, and I won't dig my own grave today!" Mark stared, paralyzed by the violence of the snapping chain. "Do it!" Sarah suddenly yelled, rising from the mud. The panic in her eyes had been replaced by a fierce, desperate realization. "Mark, move! Get the mats!" The foreman snapped out of his shock. He signaled his crew, who cautiously emerged from behind the heavy machinery. They grabbed the heavy oak timber mats from Elias's wagon and frantically dragged them into the thick mud directly in the path of the case engine's massive iron front wheels. Elias looked back at the buried crane. The cable was singing its deadly song. The steam engine was barking, its boiler shuddering under the immense pressure, fighting a battle of pure, sustained torsion against the earth. "Come on, you old girl," Elias whispered, patting the hot steel of the boiler jacket. "Don't let me down." Down in the basin, Dr. Thorne was watching the mud around the crawler crane's buried tracks. He wasn't looking at the broken chain or the roaring steam engine. He was looking at the water. The puddle of stagnant water resting against the steel chassis was bubbling. It wasn't boiling. It was being displaced. Dr. Thorne pushed his glasses up his nose, his mouth falling open. "It's not peaking," he muttered to himself. "The kinetic force isn't dropping." He finally understood what the old man had meant. When the D11 bulldozers had pulled, they applied a massive shockload of horsepower, causing the mud to instantly harden and grip tighter, snapping the ropes. But the steam engine didn't operate on sudden explosions of internal combustion. It operated on the continuous, unrelenting expansion of steam. It was applying 1,000,000 pounds of torque and then just holding it there. It was an immovable object leaning against another immovable object, waiting to see which would tire first. "The vacuum is bleeding," Dr. Thorne yelled over the roar of the engine, turning to Sarah. "The sustained pressure is giving the clay time to deform. The seal is breaking, but the mud is piling up in front of the crane's tracks like a dam. If he pulls it into that wall of dirt, it'll rip the tracks right off the frame." Sarah Jenkins, project manager, didn't need to hear the math. She saw the problem. She grabbed her radio, switching to the all-site frequency. "All excavator operators, this is Jenkins. Get in your cabs right now. Fired up." Within seconds, the massive diesel engines of 3 Cat 349 hydraulic excavators roared to life. "Do not touch the crane," Sarah barked into the radio. "I repeat, do not pull on the unit. Move your buckets directly in front of the buried tracks. Dig out the dam. Agitate the mud. Clear a path for it to roll into. Let the steam engine do the pulling. We just need to open the door." The operators, highly skilled veterans who had been forced to sit on their hands for 2 days, moved with surgical precision. The massive yellow steel arms reached down into the treacherous mud, their toothed buckets scooping away tons of the heavy, resistant clay directly in front of the buried crawler tracks. They weren't fighting the suction. They were simply removing the physical barrier the crane was about to be dragged through. Up on the hill, Elias saw the modern machines move in to assist. He gave a sharp nod of approval. He reached up and eased the throttle open just a fraction of an inch more, demanding everything the century-old boiler had to give. The exhaust barks turned into a continuous, deafening roar. The massive drive wheels slowly, agonizingly began to turn, biting into the thick oak mats Mark's crew had laid down. The case engine crept forward, a fraction of an inch at a time, taking up the slack on the winch drum, maintaining that catastrophic level of tension. Then a sound cut through the roar of the machinery. It wasn't a crack of breaking steel. It was a deep, visceral schluck. It sounded like the earth itself was taking a massive, wet breath. "Look!" Toby screamed, pointing down into the pit. The mud surrounding the massive steel tracks suddenly fissured and cracked. A massive bubble of trapped air and water violently erupted from beneath the chassis. The perfect, hermetic vacuum seal had been shattered. With the suction broken, the 500-ton crane was suddenly just dead weight. And to the 9-to-1 mechanical advantage of an 80-horsepower steam traction engine operating at peak boiler pressure, dead weight was simply a matter of time. Slowly, impossibly, the gargantuan yellow structure began to move. It didn't jerk. It didn't bounce. It glided forward through the viscous slurry with the slow, unstoppable momentum of a glacier. The massive steel tracks, caked in feet of gray clay, finally began to rotate, finding purchase on the dense timber matting the excavators had rapidly shoved into the newly cleared trench. Elias stood like a statue on the platform, his hand locked on the clutch lever, feeding the massive winch drum exactly as much steam as it needed to keep the heavy cable perfectly taut. He steered the front wheels slightly, keeping the engine centered on the oak mats as it crawled forward, dragging its massive prey out of the depths. For 20 agonizing minutes, the ballet continued. The ancient steam tractor pulling relentlessly, the modern diesel excavators gracefully clearing the path and laying mats. The contrast was absurd, beautiful, and highly effective. Finally, the front tracks of the crawler crane breached the edge of the soft zone. They climbed up onto the compacted gravel of the prepared roadway, the chassis leveled out, the dangerous 6-degree list vanishing as the center of gravity shifted back to safety. With one final, heavy pull, the massive machine rolled entirely free of the mud pit, its steel treads clanking loudly on the solid rock. It was safe. Elias Thorne immediately shoved the clutch lever forward, disengaging the winch drum. He reached up and slammed the brass throttle closed. The sudden silence was deafening. The only sounds were the violent hissing of the safety valve, venting the excess boiler pressure, and the heavy, ragged breathing of the construction crew. Then the valley erupted. Mechanics, operators, and laborers threw their hard hats into the air. The excavator operators blasted their air horns in a triumphant, disjointed symphony. Mark collapsed onto a pile of timber mats, laughing hysterically, his face smeared with grease and mud. Dr. Thorne stood frozen, staring at the slack steel cable resting in the mud. He looked from the massive, high-tech computer screens visible through the window of the command trailer, down to the hissing, coal-fired antique that had justified every stress limit equation he had run. Sarah Jenkins exhaled a breath that felt like it had been trapped in her lungs for 3 days. She wiped a tear of pure, unadulterated relief from her eye, then turned and began walking down the muddy slope toward the steam engine. Elias was already at work. He wasn't celebrating. He was methodically oiling the exposed crosshead guides, checking the heat of the Babbitt bearings with the back of his bare hand. The machine had given him everything, and he was making sure she hadn't hurt herself in the process. Sarah approached, her boots squelching in the mud. She stopped a few feet from the massive iron rear wheel. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice filled with a reverence she usually reserved for board members. Elias wiped his hands on a greasy rag and looked down at her from the platform. "Mud's a tricky thing, ma'am. You just have to know how to ask it nicely to let go." Sarah reached into the deep pocket of her high-visibility jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. She held it up to him. "As we agreed," she said. "Cash. Plus a bonus for emotional distress on my part." Elias climbed down the iron ladder. He took the envelope, feeling its weight, but he didn't open it. He simply shoved it deep into the bib pocket of his overalls. He extended his large, calloused hand. Sarah took it. His grip was just as firm as it had been the day before, but the cold hostility was gone. "I'll leave the heavy rigging and the wagon here," Elias said, gesturing to the complex web of blocks and chains. "Your boys are going to need it to drag those bulldozers out of the lower trench. Just drop it off at the farm when you're done paving this valley." "We will, I promise," Sarah said. Dr. Thorne walked up, stopping beside Sarah. The young engineer looked at the old farmer, then at the hissing boiler. "Mr. Thorne," Elias the engineer said quietly, I owe you an apology. My calculations—" "Your math was fine, son," the farmer interrupted gently, picking up his heavy steel toolbox. "You just forgot that the Earth doesn't read textbooks. It only respects leverage." Before he climbed back aboard his machine for the slow drive up the ridge, Elias Thorne reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick chunk of black artist's charcoal he kept for marking timber. He walked to the side of the massive boiler jacket. He used his sleeve to wipe away a fresh layer of splashed mud and grease, revealing a heavy raised cast-iron emblem bolted to the steel. With a few quick, practiced strokes of the charcoal, he darkened the raised lettering so it stood out starkly against the faded iron. 1920 case. He gave a sharp nod to the two engineers, climbed onto his platform, and pulled the whistle cord one last time. The piercing shriek echoed off the hills as the ancient machine slowly clanked away, leaving the modern world to finish its bridge. 40 years later, the Interstate 88 overpass was a soaring marvel of modern infrastructure, a vital artery carrying thousands of autonomous freight trucks every hour. Built seamlessly into the massive concrete abutment at the edge of the Blackwood Valley was a polished bronze plaque. It didn't list the names of the engineering firms, the politicians who cut the ribbon, or the project managers. It bore a simple inscription, dedicated to the relentless spirit of human ingenuity and the enduring strength of the land. Remember that progress is built upon the iron foundations of the past. 200 miles away, in the brightly lit, climate-controlled central atrium of the State University's College of Engineering, a group of first-year graduate students clustered together. They were holding sleek, transparent digital tablets, analyzing stress-strain curves and dynamic fluid simulations. They were surrounding a massive, meticulously restored piece of machinery that dominated the center of the hall. The black paint gleamed, the brass polished to a mirror shine. Their professor, an older man with gray hair and a slight limp, leaned heavily on a cane as he addressed them. Dr. Toby Thorne, former intern, now dean of the college, smiled as he watched his students try to comprehend the sheer analog mass of the machine before them. "You can run the finite element analysis 1,000 times," Dr. Thorne said, his voice echoing in the quiet museum hall as he tapped his cane against the massive iron wheel of the 1920 Case steam traction engine. "Your software will tell you exactly how a structure should fail under stress." He looked up at the towering smokestack, a memory of black smoke and screaming steel cables flashing in his mind. "But never forget," he told the next generation of builders, "equations only tell you how the world should work. Sometimes when the math fails and the ground turns against you, you have to put down the screen, step into the mud, and ask the earth how it wants to be moved."